Welcome to Live on Plato's Cave. My name is Mario Veen. This is episode 51, Bergson's Restless World with Emily Herring.
Strange shadows on the wall. Reality is not so real at all. Philosophy invites you to be brave. Welcome to life from Plato's cave.
If you're going to read one biography of a philosopher, read this one. It's called Herald of a Restless World, How Henri Bergson Brought Philosophy to the People. Bergson is one of the most relevant philosophers today, as a philosopher of time and a philosopher of change and a philosopher of creativity. But especially in the English-speaking world, his work is still relatively unknown or misunderstood. Time to change that. I did one episode before on Bergson's philosophy in episode 30 with Jean Proust. And after this one with Emily about his life, ideas and his way of working, I want to do more in the future. Emily Herring is a writer based in Paris. She received her PhD in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Leeds. And her writing has appeared in Aeon and the Times Literary Supplement. Emily is a great writer, and this is one of the many reasons why this biography is so good, so I really hope you will read it. I wrote a reflection on Emily's biography of Bergson in the series Challenging Time. You can find the link in the description. And if you read Dutch, my book about Plato's allegory of the cave has just come out. It's called Hoe Plato je uit je god sleurt. And I'm looking for an international publisher now for the English version. I'll let you know if I have more news about that. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Emily.
Physics, so poetry and art, interdisciplinary start. We will travel, but you're safe. Welcome to life from Plato's cave.
Welcome in Plato's cave. Thank you so much for speaking with us about your new book.
Thank you so much for having me.
I thought we should start recording because I was about to praise your book, and it's better to do that online. What I appreciate about it most is that it's really a page turner, and that's part due to Bergson's life, because he had a quite interesting life.
Yeah.
But also your writing style, and I actually know you from, I didn't know you were working on a book, but I've been following you on Twitter. Mm-hmm. So I really like you as a writer. And then I saw, you're also doing a bio on Twitter. So I'm very happy to talk to you now.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here.
So I guess a lot of research went into writing this book, right?
Yes, a lot. Because it started out, I did my PhD and my master's thesis actually on Bergson. So it's been more than a decade really in the making, if you count those years as, and I do. I mean, the research that went into those projects definitely were useful for the book. So it's a lot of research, yes. But it was only a bit later that I really got into sort of Bergson's life, because I started out obviously reading the texts. And it's only a bit later that I realized how very interesting his life was, in addition to him being a very interesting philosopher. And it's definitely a story that, as you said, I mean, you said very kindly that the book is a page turner, and I do think, it was almost a case of almost having too much material for the book, because there's so much going on in this man's life that I had to sort of weigh, how much time I was going to spend on each episode of his life, because there's, we can get into it, but yeah.
There are these biographies of like Napoleon, and they're like, I don't know, they're like 1,000 pages or 2,000 pages, right? And I'm sure you had enough material that you could have written that. why did you choose to? Because it's I don't know how many pages it is. It's like
it's fairly short. Yeah, it's about 300 pages. Well, on a very pragmatic side of things, I'm not sure my publisher would have agreed to publish a 1,000 page biography of a figure that, in the Anglophone world is still very much, unknown or underappreciated or, quite has been definitely forgotten. So yeah, you get the 800 pages if you're already a big name that everyone recognizes. I don't think you can really do that in terms of this is purely in terms of marketing, things that are completely foreign to the actual research. But so it was a case of trying to make it as interesting and concise as possible. So choices had to be made. But I really focus a lot on his fame years. So there's a bit of I spent fewer pages on his final years, even though those are also very interesting. But there's a lot on the sort of peak of his fame in the 1910s, really, when everything was happening, when he was causing traffic jams and people were fainting because there were so many people in his lectures, and sort of how that fame also impacted him negatively. He was kind of hated it, really, but also continued being pursuing his career. He didn't become a hermit as a result of it. He kind of he had ambition as well. So it was kind of those two sides of him that I find very interesting as well.
I've been fascinated by Bergson for a long time, but I've been mainly focused on Heidegger, and Bergson was already, I was looking in my bookcase. I got Matter and Memory, I think, in 2003.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been a few summer holidays where I thought, okay, this is the time, this is this summer I'm going to read it. And then I read just the introduction, but just the introduction, just basically it sent me off writing. So I didn't even get to the first chapter because I got so many ideas that I started working on my own writing. And but this really helped me to give kind of an overview, and also who is that. And for me, it really helped. I ordered now the Creative Evolution, the one that you recommended by
Donald Land, the new
exactly.
translation.
Yeah. So I want to read that one. And I think, he is so relevant. But maybe just to start, there's this show called The Writer's Craft, a podcast. I always listen to it, and you have different podcasts that are like, okay, how do writers actually write? Like, how do you set up your desk? How do you organize your day and everything? So, maybe in the sense of the philosopher's craft, what have you learned about Bergson's way of working? Because I think what you just said, that he was not a hermit, but he had a very public life, but there was also, how do you organize your life? That really sounds like a lot of people are experiencing right now. You want to do deep work, but at the same time, there's this distracting society.
Yes.
So what can you say something about his way of working?
Yeah, absolutely. He struggled a lot, as I said, with the fame aspect of his life and the social aspect of his life, precisely because he felt that it took him away from what he found to be the most important and fulfilling part of his life, which was, philosophy and thinking about philosophy. And the way that this translated is that it took him longer and longer to produce a book, and he didn't produce that many books. There are a few collections of essays, and then there's basically 4 main books that are increasingly apart in time. And the way he describes his process is that he would spend years, literally a decade, basically doing research before he was even sure about what he was getting at. He would first have to sort of ingest. So say when he was decided to write about memory and matter and memory, he sort of spent just under, I think about 11 years, basically reading everything there was to read about. He was very interested in aphasia and these theories that he was ultimately against, but these ideas that since we can locate in the brain places where, if there's a lesion there, then the person's gonna forget how to speak or forget certain words. That then means that we can locate memories. Bergson argues against this in Matter and Memory, but he spent years reading everything there was to read on these debates. And a lot of his research was empirical work, as in he read again, for creative evolution, he read everything there was to read. And I say this, without hyperbole. I truly believe he read everything there was to read in evolutionary literature, paleontology, again, over a decade. And it's in one of his article or talks, actually, that then becomes an article, he talks about following various lines of fact and then finding the place where they converge. And it's in these places where they converge that he gets to what he feels is like the truth or something that he can build upon. And yeah, that's something. So it took him 25 years to write his final book, also because he was quite ill. So that didn't help. He didn't have a lot of hours in the day where he had enough energy to really write. But again, it started out with him researching both things to do with aesthetics and ethics, and sort of he knew the general direction he was going in, but he didn't yet know where those lines of fact would converge. So when he was asked, what he was working on, he'd often say, "Well, I don't know yet, really. I'm just ingesting all of this." And he says that then he would write in a very short burst. So he'd spend a decade reading, and then he was able to write a book in 3 or 4 months, which sounds insane.
During this, sorry to interrupt. During this decade of reading, did he take notes, or did he start writing parts of the book, or did he really only start writing on the book?
I would assume he took notes. That in the archive that exists in Paris, that there are some of his books, and you can sort of see the annotations that are very sparse and very light. But my sense would be that he would have been, and I don't know this for sure because he doesn't really go into that much detail, but my sense would have been, yes, he would take probably notes on, ideas and interesting facts that he'd been reading about, interesting theories he'd been reading about. But the actual writing of the theory came much later, the actual writing of the book, I mean. So I find that quite fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, to your question on sort of how, I mean, I feel like in a sense I found that quite inspiring because there is this sense when you're researching something. So I wouldn't be as extreme as he was, where it took me more than 4 months to write the book, but I do get this sense of there's a build and a build and a build, and then suddenly something emerges. And I think that's what he's describing. And I think definitely I could relate to that. But that's maybe where the but yeah, I think it's still quite an extreme way of doing things, the way he did things. And he had this idea that you can only, if you're serious about, thinking and philosophy, you can only seriously, meaningfully get to grips with maybe 2 or 3 ideas in your whole life. And maybe this was because of his relationship to the time he was able to actually devote to work. Maybe he would have seen things differently if he hadn't been so taken up by social obligations, fame, all the chatter and all the noise surrounding him. Maybe he would have had time to feel like he could devote more time to more ideas. But yes, he had this idea that he shouldn't be asked his opinion on, social issues or even other philosophical issues than the ones that he was already working on, because he felt that he needed to sort of he would need to start anew each new problem asks for a whole new set of reflection and methodology almost, which is also something I find quite interesting, because that's not necessarily the way most people would go about thinking about this. A lot of people would think that you have a system and you can then apply your theory to various problems. And he was very anti this way of doing things. He didn't think that his ideas could be applied or taken out of context. And this was also in the context where he was being told by journalists that he was the father of, symbolism and cubism, and which were art movements he knew nothing about. So he was very confused about all of that. So I think this was also a way for him to say no, distance himself from things he didn't quite understand, and say, you can't take my ideas and slap them onto these, ideologies or movements or manifestos, because there's no real link there.
And how was it for you as a biographer to research a man like that? Because you also write that I think he gave instructions to have always unfinished writings burned, and he didn't want people to know about his life. And at the same time, you have all these, you're constantly saying about how he almost hypnotized people with his voice and with his speaking. But there's only one recording left of him, so you cannot listen to those recordings. There's so many gaps in his life, and at the same time, you even say that writing a biography is the most un-Bergsonian thing to do. So so maybe the first question should be, why did you decide to write a biography anyway?
I meant it in two ways when I said it's un-Bergsonian to write a biography. And the first meaning, or the first reason, is because it is almost a joke about his philosophy itself, which is that, when you're writing a biography, you have this external view, you hold all the elements in one go, and you can sort of pick and choose and juxtapose and treat moments in someone's life as if they're these sort of external movable parts, which is the exact opposite of how Bergson conceived sort of the internal maturation of consciousness through time. But that's one reason. But then, yes, this other reason, which is much more concrete and much more to do with the ethics, really, of biography writing, where, yes, in his will, Bergson explicitly says, and even in other areas, there's other moments when he says this, you can't learn anything from a philosopher by studying their life, and I do not want my life to be studied. He instructs his wife to, as you said, destroy all his correspondence and anything he was working on after his death, because he knew that, given his level of fame, or the fame that he'd had during his life, he knew that all of this would be picked apart. And I think he was afraid of things being set in stone in a way that he couldn't control. And this is obviously something that, as a scholar, as a Bergson scholar, it's something you have to grapple with, the ethics of this. So someone explicitly saying, I do not want this. And yet he said he didn't want his lectures to be published. He didn't want his correspondence to be published. And these have all been published. And there's even a second volume of his correspondence that's just come out, over 1,000 letters, I think. And yeah, I had to ask myself this: why am I doing this if the subject of the biography doesn't want it? And funnily enough, I found myself thinking about Chapel Roan and all these, or the current day celebrities who are suffering from the invasiveness of everyone trying to look into their private life. And one obvious difference is that Bergson himself and anyone who ever knew him, who ever met him, are all gone now. There's no one who's going to feel harassed as a result of me doing my research today. There's kind of this historical distance, which I get a sense, in terms of ethics, makes a big difference. But also, I think there's a historian's entitlement, or the sense that Bergson's story, I think, goes beyond him. The reason I wanted to tell the story, I think there are two main reasons. One is that I throughout my studies, I was shocked to see how little the Anglophone scholars knew about Bergson, as in most of the philosophers I encountered in English-speaking countries had never heard of him or knew very little. And I do think that one way to get people interested in anything is to tell a good story. And I think his story is so interesting that it can bring interest to his philosophy. So that's one reason. And the other reason is, as I think I just said, his story and it kind of goes beyond him in the sense that we can learn a lot about the mood of his time through his life and his story, because he was so central and he sort of hailed as such an icon, a representative of the mood of a generation, whether he liked it or not. People in the late Belle Epoque, all the people who flocked around him, really felt that they were getting from his philosophy, they were getting kind of a message of what they viewed as a message of hope in a world that they saw as increasingly mechanized and disenchanted, to use the Weber notion. And so I genuinely think that there's something, it goes beyond him. It's no longer up to him, in a sense. In order to understand our world and the world around him, his story is a really good anchoring point. So there's those two things. And then also I just think it's a really interesting story. There are all these episodes with all these celebrity cameos from from people, with Proust and Einstein and Bertrand Russell, and the fact that we may even find a partial explanation to how the US ended up joining World War One. It's quite it's not a story that's been told a lot, that Bergson was sent by the French government on a kind of secret mission in 1917 to meet President Wilson and basically try and convince him to join the war.
Oh yeah, and here we have the connection with Plato, right?
Yeah, the philosopher in and his role in the Republic, and yes, this vision of the philosopher, the role the philosopher can play. But all of that was just to say that I think the story itself matters. His life itself matters.
Yeah, and his life is finished now in this sense. And could he have realized how important... there's some other ways where your life is also part of your philosophy, in the sense that people can learn from it, but they can learn from it in ways that you yourself cannot control. And if you can control what you're writing on the page, at least. And I think we were just talking about one of the previous episodes where a geoscientist who knows so much about climate change and what's been happening and everything, and she says, one of the most important things we need to do right now is change our relationship to time. So yeah, there you have it. I really also appreciate philosophers who change their mind. And somewhere in the beginning, when he started to develop his idea of durée, you described that he changed his mind. Maybe that's also a way to talk a little bit about his philosophy. But the question I had as well is that because for instance, Wittgenstein is always mentioned as someone who wrote one book and then he completely changed his mind. But you could say, I don't want to sell him short, but you could say that he looked at language one way, like to describe the world, and then he changed his mind in the sense, oh no, language is not there to describe the world, language is doing something, it's performative. So and that's very radical, but it's a change of philosophical position. But I don't know, of course it's translated from French, but you talk about that he has he writes to a friend that I cannot help but attach great importance to the change in my way of thinking which occurred. So my question was, is this just a different position with regard to a topic like time, or is there something in how he was thinking that changed?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question that I really appreciate. And yeah, it would help maybe if I go through the motions of what happened and how his thinking changed, and then get back to that part of the question afterwards. So contrary to Wittgenstein, this change in Bergson's way of thinking occurs really before he publishes anything of significance. It's kind of, it happens as he's writing his PhD dissertation that will then become his first book, Time and Free Will. And the change he's referring to here is that before he started writing his PhD dissertation, when he was a student at the École Normale Supérieure, he was a big fan of Herbert Spencer, who was very famous in France and elsewhere. And Bergson had developed this ambition to use his doctoral studies as an opportunity to pursue Spencer's project of what Spencer called his synthetic philosophy. So this kind of all-encompassing theory of overarching general philosophical principles, but that kind of embraced. Bergson saw it as a materialistic project and a sort of mechanistic project even. And this idea that the philosopher is in a more general position than the empirical scientist, and the philosopher is able to come up with sort of general guiding principles based on what the scientist is coming up with. That's Bergson saw himself as what he calls a philosopher of science. That's what he said at the time. And the change occurred when he started going, that's how he tells it anyway. He started this project, and as part of this project, which would be based on the physics of his time and the science of his time, he started looking at all the sort of main concepts of mechanics. And he says that it's when he looked at time as it is described in mechanics that he was surprised to find that there was no temporality at all in this notion of time. And similarly, the notion of change or the notion of movement, he found no change or no movement in these. So one way he talks about this change is, he says that he has some kind of eureka moment when he's explaining one of Zeno's paradoxes on the blackboard to his high school students. He's talking about the paradox in which Achilles and the tortoise are racing, and the paradox essentially goes that, the tortoise has a head start, and Achilles can never overtake the tortoise, because before he catches up, he has to cover half the distance, but before he can cover half the distance, he has to cover a quarter or half of that half to infinity. And so Zeno has proved that change is impossible, except Bergson says it hit him that day that the only thing Zeno had been able to prove was that you can divide a geometrical line to infinity, but that says nothing about movement or the change that is actually occurring. That was kind of his initial intuition, really. And similarly with the time as it is used in physics, it's this realization that time, as it is represented in these equations, but also in everyday language, and also in most of Western philosophy, contains no temporality at all. I've already said that, and I'm gonna get more precise. But what we usually do when we talk about time is that we're borrowing from a category that's external to time, which is space. We have to, in order to be able to measure or even just conceptualize and talk about something that's in flux, we have to immobilize it, and we have to treat it as something that is immobile. And there's a thought experiment that is in his first book. So in his dissertation that I think is really helpful to understand what he means and the difference he's getting at between sort of mathematical time, say, and what he calls durée. And it's this idea that if we imagine that there's some kind of evil demon, not unlike Descartes' evil genie, but messing with us in a different kind of way, who decides that Earth will now rotate on its axis in 12 hours instead of 24 hours, and that all other phenomena will accelerate in the same proportion. Bergson says that to the equations of astrophysics, this will make no difference at all. But to the astrophysicists themselves, it will make a huge difference. Perhaps it wouldn't be immediately apparent that there's been a quantitative change, but there would be this sort of qualitative change in the way that we perceive the sort of progress that is accomplished in our day, the accumulation of our own experience would change. And that's really the difference that he's getting at. So this is what he kind of discovers as he's initially embarking on this Spencerian project. He ends up completely throwing that initial project aside and writing something completely different, where he ends up engaging with sort of the debates in experimental psychology of his day and going against the psychophysicists who were the people who believed that you could completely quantify internal experiences. And so was it a real change in his way of thinking? I would say yes, in the sense that he goes from seeing himself as a sort of positivist, materialist, who is not interested in metaphysics in the slightest, and who thinks that, we should only be interested in these sort of general guiding principles, and we should only be interested in the question how and not in the question why, and we shouldn't be interested in spirit. Anything to do with sort of spirit and psychology was something he wasn't interested in at all. And he goes from that to almost the reverse position. He doesn't, as many of his opponents have claimed, he didn't become anti-science and he didn't become anti-rationalist. But the change that operated, I think, within him is that instead of seeing the philosopher as the one being in the most general position and the scientist being the one closest to reality, he kind of sees that there's a kind of switch there, and he thinks actually the scientists are the ones that are using symbols and abstractions to transform reality, which is in flux, into something measurable and therefore static. So they're the ones operating at the greatest level of generality, and actually the philosopher is the one who is able to sort of plunge directly into this sort of flux type thing that is reality. And consciousness, in a way that science and concepts and anything that freezes reality into a box just can't do. So it's a complete shift in his way of viewing what philosophy is, in my sense, in my understanding. Yeah, that was a very long answer.
No, I really appreciate it. But so what I understand is that then he describes what philosophy should be. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times it's, I think, still today aiming to construct concepts, there's even, there's of course the branch of analytic philosophy, and he's distinguishing between analysis and intuition, mm-hmm. which, just to share something, one insight I had is because I work a lot with psychologists as well, but in the sense of in the context of climate, we have all the knowledge, we have all the technology, we have all the political frameworks. So why aren't we doing what we should be doing if we really mean that our children are dearest to us and we want to, have them have a nice future as well?
Yeah.
And So then one way of saying, which I really appreciate, one step is saying we can't understand this by just looking at natural science alone. We need psychology as well, and we need sociology as well. But then what the psychologists and sociologists do, they have all these wonderful models. They have insight in behaviors and different personality types and everything like that. But then I think Bergson goes one step further. I mean, this is maybe my question here. So if I understand this correctly, that he's saying that the kind of analytic approach of psychology is not enough to really understand what's going on.
Yeah, and we have to remember sort of the context of what psychology is, in the late 19th, early 20th century. But I think there's psychology and then there's metaphysics, I think, for him. And I think what he finds kind of categorically unhelpful is the kind of psychology that is trying to reduce the mind to matter, and to say that we can quantify consciousness. What he responds to that is, what you are quantifying is no longer consciousness, and you're not dealing with that directly. I think where he goes further is with his idea of what metaphysics is, and I think his definition of what metaphysics is and his definition of what he calls intuition are still quite misunderstood, and still, they're not the general definitions that we would give to these words, even though a general definition of metaphysics might be difficult to come up with anyway.
Yeah, so they're really attractive concepts, right? If you read a little bit about Bergson and you think, oh, he's saying we shouldn't do analysis, we should be more intuitive. And then, of course, intuition has all these meanings that we know, but then probably we're running with the concept, but probably that's not what he was getting at.
Absolutely, because first of all, because Bergson is not saying we shouldn't be analytical, and he's not saying we shouldn't do analysis. He's actually saying we have to do analysis to make sense of the overwhelming diversity of reality, and in order to basically be able to apply knowledge to anything practical, anything technological, anything like that requires anything like a measurement, we have to. Or if we're a biologist and we want to come up with a classification, then we have to be analytical about a reality that resists analysis, which is life, but we have to. That's the only option that we have. But we should not take analysis as as having the last word, because there's actually another way of investigating reality, which he calls metaphysics, and then intuition is kind of his method, or the way in which what he opposes to analysis, which doesn't require practical results, and therefore can allow itself to kind of try and do away with all the models and symbols and concepts, which is very hard to grasp when it's just laid out like this, because you kind of automatically are thinking, well, what in the world can that mean? But just to reiterate, he's really not saying that we shouldn't analyze. He's saying that we kind of need both, or at least analysis and intuition, science and metaphysics can collaborate and should collaborate. So that in itself I find really refreshing and interesting, because it kind of goes with a whole anti-specialization thing that he has going on since he's quite young. That he when he was a lot younger, he was very good at mathematics, but he wanted to go into philosophy because as a teenager, he was already thinking, if I go into mathematics, I'm only going to be doing mathematics. Whereas if I do philosophy, I'm going to, keep all of my horizons open. I can investigate any aspect of the world and of reality through philosophy in a way that I'd be restricting myself if I was doing mathematics. So that's just to say there's this will to be in synthesis mode rather than in specialization mode. And I can't remember exactly where I was going with that, but yeah, I kind of went on a little tangent there. But I think it's important to say that because it's so easy to, if one has been exposed only to Bertrand Russell's assessment of Bergson, or even some more recent, even Stanford encyclopedia articles, or the image of Bergson that is given is this kind of intuitive thinker. What he means by intuition is something very rigorous. Yeah, I'll let you hone this in maybe a bit because I'm going all over the place.
No, that is great because it's I think it's very difficult to speak about this. And maybe that also has to do with what he says in many ways, and you say it as well, is that he's saying, well, if we are doing philosophy, but we are using concepts, and concepts are very important, and this is part of what we need to do. Mm-hmm. But he's also trying to get at something else. Mm-hmm. And that actually reminds me of the Republic, where Plato says a few times, like he's asked, okay, can you explain this philosophy to me that you are, Plato is using all these, the cave allegory and all these kind of different things. But the one time when he's asked like explicitly, oh, but what is your philosophy? Can you explain that to me? And he says, yeah, the kind of philosophy that I'm talking about cannot be explained. And it's this, I mean, I feel this paradox as well, like he wants you to grasp something, but it's difficult because the moment you use a word, it conjures up all these kinds of meanings. So then you have to talk about, yeah, but it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this, in the hope that you somehow get it or something.
Yeah, and there's also a sense in which, for Bergson, language itself kind of tricks us into, because of the way language works, which essentially you can see it as a way of tidying up, at least concepts, the way concepts work. You can see it as a way of tidying up the overwhelming diversity of the world into boxes that then, in which can hold an overwhelming diversity of things under one category. And we, again, have to function that way in order to communicate. But in doing so, we lose the particular flavor of the particular reality that we're describing when we use a label, like anything really. If you say that you're feeling sad, you're not going to convey the particular flavor of sadness that is your sadness. And what Bergson is trying to say is that it's the way language works as well that tricks us into spatializing our own inner experience and treating the uninterrupted flow of our own consciousness as something that has a clear, distinct before and after, because that's the way we talk. We say, I was hungry and then I was no longer hungry. I used to be a child, now I'm an adult. When actually it's something that is an there's nothing like these clear boundaries in consciousness, in durée. So he's actually having to battle against language. He's having to use language against the shortcomings of language. So that's something that's tricky. And that, you quickly get into this territory of, well, I can't tell you what it is, that I'm trying to say. But the thing that is quite magical, and I don't use the, I should have hesitated to use this word, but it's a word that William James uses a lot when he talks about Bergson. The thing that's quite really just impressive with Bergson is how his use of language, metaphorical language, imaged language, as a kind of rigorous philosophical method, the idea being, since concepts are too much like ready-to-wear clothes, when what we want are tailor-made clothes, we would like to have concepts that perfectly fit the reality we're trying to describe, but because of the nature of language, since language generalizes, concepts are generalizations, then we can't have that. And so metaphors and images are slightly better because they're going to point the reader in a certain direction. And what Bergson wants to do often is actually use a variety of images that all sort of each one carries a certain aspect of what he's trying to get at. And it's kind of this hope that in the reading process, the reader is going to sort of see the direction that Bergson is pointing at, since he cannot come up with a concept of what durée is, or what life is, or what consciousness is, simply because the concept itself would not be able to contain the fluidity of the realities he's describing. So there's this really interesting kind of antagonism, this movement of pushback and using language against the limitations of language, and that kind of has to do with what intuition is for Bergson. I could go on for hours, so you have to stop me because
No, I mean, this is so fascinating. I would love to speak for hours. I actually did one with someone who wrote about Stiegler, and we talked for 2.5 hours, and it was the most listened to. So maybe we could do like a marathon thing maybe sometime later. But for now, I think it's important that people get the flavor. I hope they read the book, because that's why you, I think, put all this work in the book, and you really use the words that you use and the images and everything like that. This is my guess, that you also want people to get a sense of what Bergson was about or something. Mm-hmm. Can I say it like this?
Definitely. Yeah. And also to kind of undo some of the falsehoods, I think, that have sort of persisted. This idea that Bergson is not only scientifically illiterate, but also anti-science is completely false. He was extremely well-versed in, mathematics, and also well-read in the science of his day. And also he was extremely interested in science and fascinated by it, and thought that, and this highly irritated him actually when he read things about him describing him as anti-science, anti-rational. There's nowhere in anything he writes that you can really get that, but in Bertrand Russell, in some of the interpretations that have been given of some of his works, and also his kind of infamous public debate with Einstein, these have all contributed to an image of someone who's kind of into wishy-washy intuition, vitalism kind of things, when actually in reality he's much more closer to positivism than you would think, in the sense that he believes that metaphysics could be a cumulative, like science is cumulative. He believes that metaphysics could be a kind of cumulative discipline as well, which I think is really weird and fascinating. And he's much more interested into sort of positive knowledge than one would think from the portrait that has been left of him by some not so well-intentioned sometimes writers. Like Russell is a bit of a villain in my book, in my book and in the book. In that respect. So I wanted to set things straight, and also give a real feel of what the ideas are, without obviously going into the detail that some scholars have done in their sort of introductions to his ideas, which I highly recommend. And I've got a list of them at the end of the book for people who sort of further reading, people who want to go further. But I think at the beginning of the book, I described the book as sort of 3 intertwined portraits: portrait of Bergson, and a portrait of his philosophy as well, and then a portrait of the world in which sort of both existed, the man and the philosophy. But I'm trying to present the philosophy in a light that is comprehensible and sort of engaging, in the hope that then people will go off and read things on their own time.
And have you seen this movie Arrival? Or
yes.
So I want to ask, how has it been for you to study Bergson? Because in Arrival, there's this linguist, and let's say Bergson is the alien in this case. So she and a physicist are studying the alien language, and as they do that, her experience of time changes. So have you had this happen to you too, that you feel like, hey, something changed, or it's starting to seep in my own life, besides just being an academic subject?
I think it's more so that I end up seeing Bergson in places where, I'm probably the only one. And I'm trying to think of examples now, but sometimes I'll be reading a novel even and think, oh, this is 100% Bergson. Or I will be sometimes, reading up about some things that have nothing to do with Bergson. I was reading something about different ways in which, computer programmers can work, and there were various ways in which they did it, and one of them was kind of advocating taking temporality into account and things like that. So I'm always kind of, I have these sort of Bergson radars that are constantly flashing. And actually the arrival thing just made me think I need to find, there's an article, someone's written an article on this film in relation to Bergson, and I can't remember what it says.
Oh, really?
Even, but I'll have to send that to you. But yeah, but in a more profound sense, maybe the ways in which Bergson encourages us to be, to sort of, he describes ways in which there's our social self that functions a lot by habit and almost ready-made, phrases and ready-made ways of looking at the world. And that helps us function in our social lives. But that can sometimes mask us to, our more profound self. That's how he calls it, which is a lot less stereotyped and a lot less, something a lot more unique. And I do think I do have that in mind a lot. When I'm interacting with people, I think, I sometimes hear myself say something and think, oh, that's my social self. It's not my profound self in which my pure duration is flowing. This is more stereotypical. So I think, yeah, he got me there.
And are you like Bergson in the sense that now you've completed this decade of research, written a book? The most annoying question, which I'm not going to ask you, is like, oh, what's your next book about, right? You're going to, hope that this book does very well and everything like that. But okay, so I won't ask you that, but I will ask you, so are you going to start with a completely different, clean slate to think about your next project, or?
I think so, yeah. I think I can't answer, very much like Bergson. I can't tell you what I'm doing next yet, even though I do have a few lines of fact and inquiry. But yeah, I do think I'm not done with Bergson in the sense that he'll always be in my mind, but perhaps I'm done with him in a more concrete sense and moving on to other things.
Well, thank you so much for your book, first of all, and for this talk about it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been lovely.
Everything we see and seem is but a dream within a dream. Strange